The whip of cold wind hit Elena Voss across the face the moment the cellar door slammed shut above her, and the sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed through the dark like a verdict. She pressed both palms against the rough wood, pushing with everything she had, but it did not move even an inch. Somewhere above her, muffled through the floorboards, she could hear Marisol laughing. "Let her sit down there and think about her place," Marisol said to someone, her voice thick with satisfaction. "A ceremony for queens is no place for a girl with a face like a smudged painting." Elena backed away from the door and let her body sink onto an overturned crate. Dust rose around her ankles. The only light came from a narrow crack near the ceiling, where a sliver of moonlight cut through and landed on the stone floor like a blade. Tonight of all nights, this was where she would be. Not standing in the great hall with the rest of the eligible women of the kingdom, not waiting to be seen by the Alpha King himself, locked away, forgotten, as she always had been since her father closed his eyes for the last time 3 years ago. She pulled her knees to her chest and let herself remember, just for a moment, what her life had been before Marisol arrived. Her father, Edmund Voss, had been the last surviving heir of a proud but quiet pack line, one that had faded from the political maps of the kingdom generations ago, but had never lost its dignity. He used to tell her stories about her mother, a woman whose name he spoke so rarely that Elena sometimes worried she might forget the sound of it herself. Lyra. Her mother's name had been Lyra, and she died giving Elena life. All Elena had left of her were a few old letters, a single portrait with a cracked frame, and a strange mark on the inside of her wrist that looked like a small crescent moon, pale and easy to miss unless someone looked closely. Marisol had never looked closely at anything about Elena except her flaws. From the day her father remarried, Elena understood that she would never be treated as a true daughter in that house. Marisol arrived with 2 daughters of her own, Priya and Odette, girls with glossy hair and confident laughter, girls who knew how to fill a room the moment they entered it. Elena had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred books to gatherings, the one whose face, according to Marisol, was unfortunate and better kept out of company. It had started as small comments, a raised eyebrow here, a pitying sigh there. But over the years, after her father's death left Marisol as the head of the household with no one to answer to, the comments grew sharper, crueler, more constant, until Elena had learned to make herself small, to walk through her own home, like a ghost who was tolerated, but never wanted. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, every eligible woman in the kingdom, whether born into nobility or born into a modest pack family, had been summoned to the royal grounds for the mating ceremony, the ancient ritual through which the Alpha King would choose his fated mate. It was said that the king would not judge by appearance alone. Each woman would stand veiled before him, and he would rely on instinct, scent, and the pull of fate itself to recognize the one meant for him. It was the only night of the year when a girl's face did not matter, when a girl like Elena, with no fortune and no name that anyone remembered, could stand equal to any noble daughter in the land. Marisol had made certain that Elena would never get that chance. "You will only embarrass this family," Marisol had said earlier that evening, watching from the doorway as Priya and Odette were fitted into gowns the color of sunrise and dusk. "A king like Cale Draven does not want a girl who looks like she belongs in a kitchen. Stay here. It is kinder to everyone, including yourself." Elena had wanted to argue, had wanted to remind Marisol that the royal decree required every eligible woman of pack blood to attend, that this was not Marisol's choice to make. But arguing with Marisol had never worked. It only ever made things worse. So Elena had said nothing, and Marisol had rewarded her silence by locking her in the cellar the moment the carriages were ready to leave. Now, sitting in the dark with dust on her skirts and the distant sound of hooves fading into the night, Elena allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel sorry for herself. She pressed her forehead to her knees and let the tears come, hot and quiet, because there was no one there to see them, and pretending to be strong took more energy than she had left. But when the minute passed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and made herself sit up straight. Her father used to say that self-pity was a comfortable chair that never led anywhere good. She had hated that saying as a child. Tonight, she understood it. She stood and pressed her palm flat against the door again, feeling for any weakness in the old wood. It was then that she heard soft footsteps on the other side, careful ones, not the heavy stomp of a guard, or the click of Marisol's shoes. A key scraped gently into the lock. The door opened just enough for a familiar face to appear in the gap. It was Wren, the housemaid who had served the Voss family since before Elena was born. An older woman, with silver-streaked hair and hands roughened from decades of work. Wren had always shown Elena small kindnesses when no one else was watching. A warm meal saved from the fire. A blanket left outside her door on cold nights. A few words of comfort murmured under her breath. But she had never done anything as bold as this. "Quickly now," Wren whispered, glancing over her shoulder toward the empty hallway. "We do not have much time. The carriages left 20 minutes ago, but the ceremony gates do not close until the moon reaches its highest point. If we hurry, there may still be a chance." Elena stared at her, stunned into stillness for a moment. "Wren, if Marisol finds out you helped me, then I will have finally done something worth losing my position over," Wren said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I have watched that woman treat you like a stain on this family for years, child, and I have said nothing because I was afraid. I am still afraid. But your father was a good man, and he loved you more than his own life. He would not want you sitting in a cellar while your future walks out the door without you. Now come. There is something you need to see first." Wren led her up through the servants' passage, avoiding the main halls where any remaining household staff might notice them, until they reached the small attic room that had once belonged to Elena's mother. Elena had not set foot in that room in years. Marisol had ordered it sealed not long after the wedding, calling it a shrine to the dead that serves no living purpose. But Wren had never obeyed that order completely. She had only made it look obeyed. Inside, beneath a heavy cloth in the corner, sat an old wooden trunk with a tarnished brass clasp. Wren knelt beside it and opened the lid with careful, reverent hands, as though she were opening something sacred. "Your mother left this behind," Wren said. "She wanted you to have it when you were old enough to understand what it meant. I have kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment. I believe tonight is that moment." Inside the trunk lay a gown the color of moonlight on water, silver and pale blue, with delicate embroidery along the sleeves that seemed to catch what little light there was in the room and hold it, glowing faintly. Beside it lay a veil, thin and shimmering, edged with small crystal beads that caught the candlelight like scattered stars. Elena reached out and touched the fabric with trembling fingers. It felt cool and soft, nothing like the plain wool dresses she had worn her entire life. "This was your mother's," Wren said quietly. "She wore something very like it on the day she married your father. She came from a family with old blood, older than most in this kingdom remember now, though the details were never spoken of much even in her own lifetime. She always told me that one day, you would need it, and that when that day came, you would know." Elena did not fully understand what Wren meant, but she did not have time to ask questions. Somewhere outside, a distant bell tolled, marking the hour, and Wren's expression shifted from tenderness to urgency. "We have very little time left," Wren said, already reaching to unfasten the buttons of Elena's plain dress. "Let us get you ready." What followed felt like a blur to Elena, a rush of trembling hands and quiet instructions, the gown slipping over her head and settling against her skin, as though it had been made specifically for her, the veil pinned carefully into her dark hair, hiding her face from view, just as the ceremony required. Wren produced a small mirror, cracked at one corner, and held it up so Elena could see herself for just a moment, before the veil obscured everything. Elena barely recognized the girl looking back at her. The gown seemed to catch the moonlight streaming through the small attic window and hold it against her skin, giving her an almost otherworldly glow. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like the ugly, unwanted daughter that Marisol had spent years convincing her she was. She felt for just a moment like someone who belonged. "There is no carriage left for you," Wren said, breaking the spell of the moment. "You will have to run. The royal grounds are nearly 2 miles from here, through the forest path if you want to arrive before the gates close. Can you do this?" Elena thought of every cruel word Marisol had ever spoken to her. She thought of years spent believing she was too plain, too unworthy, too forgettable to matter to anyone. And something inside her, something that had been quietly gathering strength beneath all that pain, finally hardened into resolve. "I can do this," she said, and for the first time in years, she meant it completely. She ran. The forest path was dark and uneven. roots reaching up from the ground like grasping fingers. But Elena did not slow down. The silver gown, impossibly, did not tear or catch on the branches that brushed against her as she passed. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the trees finally opened onto the wide moonlit fields surrounding the royal grounds, where torches lined a long stone path leading toward towering gates that were, even now, beginning to swing closed. A guard at the gate raised a hand, ready to turn her away, his eyes sweeping over her with obvious suspicion, at a lone woman, arriving on foot, with no carriage and no escort. Elena did not stop to explain herself. She simply held up the small emblem sewn into the hem of her veil, an old mark of her mother's family that Wren had shown her only minutes before, one that any trained guard of the kingdom would recognize as a legitimate house sigil, faded and half-forgotten though it was. The guard's eyes widened slightly. Whatever hesitation he had disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. He stepped aside and pulled the gate open just wide enough for her to slip through. "You are the last one," he said quietly. "The doors to the hall are closing. Hurry." Elena did not need to be told twice. She lifted the hem of her gown and ran the final stretch across the polished stone courtyard, past startled attendants and curious onlookers, who turned to watch the strange, breathless woman rushing toward the great doors of the ceremonial hall. She reached them just as two guards began to push them shut, and without thinking, without hesitating, she slipped through the narrowing gap and into the golden light beyond, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she almost did not hear the doors seal closed behind her with a heavy, final sound. Inside, the hall stretched before her like something out of a dream, vast and glowing with 1,000 candles, its ceiling arched so high that shadows pooled in the corners far above. Rows upon rows of women stood along either side of a long crimson carpet, each veiled in silks of every color imaginable, waiting silently for their turn to be seen. At the far end, upon a raised dais, sat a throne carved from dark wood, and though Elena could not yet see him clearly from this distance, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that the Alpha King himself sat upon it. She had made it. Against every obstacle Marisol had placed in her path, against the cellar door and the locked room, and years of being told she was unworthy, Elena Voss stood inside the great hall on the night of the mating ceremony, veiled like every other woman there, indistinguishable from the daughters of nobility around her. For the first time in her life, no one could look at her and see only her face. Tonight, for reasons she did not yet understand, but felt with every beating pulse in her body, that fact felt like it might change everything. She took a slow breath, steadied her trembling hands, and stepped forward to take her place among the waiting rows, unaware that at the front of the hall, the Alpha King had just lifted his head, nostrils flaring slightly, as though something in the air had shifted the moment the great doors closed behind her. The antechamber was quiet compared to the noise of the main hall, its walls lined with tall windows overlooking a private garden, filled with blooming flowers of every color imaginable. Cale guided Elena to a pair of cushioned chairs near the window, gesturing for her to sit while Aldrich positioned himself discreetly near the door, ensuring their privacy while remaining close enough to attend to any needs that might arise. "I imagine this entire day has been overwhelming for you," Cale said, settling into the chair across from her, his expression carrying genuine concern, rather than the formal distance Elena had expected from royalty. "Please, take whatever time you need." Elena took a steadying breath, still trying to process the whirlwind of events that had brought her to this quiet, sunlit room. "I did not expect any of this," she admitted honestly. "I was told, quite firmly, that I would never be considered worthy of your attention." "By your stepmother," Cale said, his jaw tightening slightly at the memory of Marisol's desperate protests in the main hall. "Tell me about your circumstances, Elena. I sense there is a great deal beneath the surface that you have not yet had the opportunity to share." And so Elena told him, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as she realized he was truly listening, truly interested in understanding her life, rather than simply evaluating her suitability for a role she had never imagined pursuing. She spoke of her mother's early death, of her father's second marriage, of the slow, steady erosion of her position within her own household, as Marisol systematically stripped away every remaining piece of comfort and dignity she had once possessed. Cale listened without interruption, his expression shifting through concern, quiet anger, and finally something that looked remarkably like admiration, as Elena described the years of difficult labor, the constant criticism, the deliberate attempts to convince her of her own unworthiness. "And yet," Cale said softly, once she had finished, "you still found the courage to insist on your rightful place at this ceremony, despite every obstacle placed before you." "I had help," Elena admitted, thinking of Nora's quiet kindness, of Ren's encouragement in the village square, of her mother's hidden legacy that had given her the strength to believe, even briefly, that she deserved more than what Marisol had decided for her. "I could not have done this alone. The people who help us reveal who they truly are, just as much as we do," Cale observed thoughtfully. "It speaks well of your character, that others were willing to risk so much to see you treated fairly." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of the coldness or arrogance she had half expected from a king raised amid such power and privilege, but found instead genuine warmth, genuine curiosity, a patience that suggested he truly valued understanding her as a person, rather than simply as a symbol or a solution to some ceremonial requirement. "May I ask you something?" Elena said finally, gathering her courage. "What exactly did you feel when you stood before me in that hall? I do not fully understand what happened." Cale considered the question carefully before answering, his expression thoughtful. "It is difficult to explain in words that fully capture the sensation," he said slowly. "Every ruler in my bloodline has described it differently, though the core experience remains consistent across generations. A recognition, almost instinctive, that transcends simple attraction or admiration. When I stood before you, something within me simply knew, with absolute certainty, that you were meant to be found. It felt less like a discovery, and more like a remembering, as though some part of me had always known you were out there, waiting." Elena felt a warm shiver travel through her at his words, something resonating deep within her chest, that echoed the strange, undeniable pull she had felt standing before him in the grand hall, though she had been too overwhelmed in the moment to fully articulate the sensation herself. "I felt something too," she admitted quietly. "I do not know how to explain it properly, but standing before you, something inside me settled, as though a piece of myself I did not even know was missing had suddenly been found." Cale's expression softened further at her words, and for a long moment, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the extraordinary circumstances slowly settling into something that felt, remarkably, like peace. "I must ask you something important," Cale said eventually, his tone growing more serious. "This connection between us, whatever fate has decreed it to be, does not obligate you to anything. Elena, you have spent years having your choices taken from you by others. I will not be another person who does that to you. If you wish to take time to consider what this might mean before committing to anything further, I will respect that decision completely." Elena felt a fresh wave of emotion at his words, surprised by the depth of consideration he was offering her, a freedom of choice she had rarely experienced in her adult life. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you likely realize." "Then take whatever time you need," Cale said gently, "though I hope you will allow me the opportunity to know you better regardless of what you ultimately decide about our connection. Your friendship alone would be a gift I would treasure." Before Elena could respond, the antechamber door opened abruptly, and Marisol burst through, her composure completely abandoned now, her face flushed with fury and desperation as she took in the sight of Elena and the king seated together in quiet, private conversation. "Your Majesty, I must speak with you immediately," Marisol said, ignoring proper protocol entirely in her evident panic. "There are things you do not understand about this girl, about her family, things that must be considered before you proceed any further with this ridiculous notion." Cale rose from his chair, his expression hardening at the interruption, though he maintained his composure with visible effort. "You will address me with proper respect," he said firmly, "and you will explain what you believe I need to understand, though I warn you now, further attempts to diminish Elena's worth will not be received favorably." Marisol hesitated for a moment, clearly recalculating her approach in the face of Cale's obvious protectiveness toward Elena, before continuing with slightly more measured desperation. "Her family line," Marisol said carefully, "carries a troubled history. Her mother's people were involved in matters that led to their standing being stripped from official records. Surely you would not wish to align yourself and this kingdom with such a tainted lineage." Elena felt her stomach tighten at these words. The mysterious hints Ren and Nora had offered suddenly given form and substance through Marisol's accusation, though she still did not fully understand what her stepmother meant by tainted, or what exactly had happened to erase her mother's family from official records. Cale's expression shifted, thoughtful rather than alarmed, his gaze moving briefly to Elena before returning to Marisol. "What exactly do you know about her mother's family history?" he asked, his tone carefully controlled, despite the evident interest behind the question. "Enough to know it should give you serious pause," Marisol said, though her confidence seemed to waver slightly under the weight of Cale's steady scrutiny. "There was a betrayal, generations ago, involving a rival pack. The details were kept quiet, deliberately buried, but the consequences remain, regardless of how much time has passed." Aldrich, who had remained silent near the door throughout the exchange, stepped forward now, his expression thoughtful. "Your Majesty, if I may," he said carefully, "I recall certain records from the royal archives, matters from several generations past, involving disputed pack lineages. It may be worth investigating further before proceeding with any formal decisions." Cale nodded slowly, considering this suggestion, before turning his attention back to Elena, his expression softening once more despite the tension still lingering in the room. "Whatever history exists within your family's past," he said gently, "it does not change what I felt standing before you today, nor does it diminish the person you have proven yourself to be, through your own actions and character. But if there are matters worth understanding more fully, I believe we owe it to both our futures to investigate them properly." Elena nodded, her mind racing with questions she had never thought to ask, mysteries surrounding her mother's past that suddenly felt far more significant than she had ever imagined. "I would like to understand the truth as well," she said quietly. "My mother rarely spoke of her family, and I have always wondered why." "Then we shall discover the truth together," Cale said firmly, casting one final, warning glance toward Marisol before addressing Aldrich directly. "Have the royal archives searched immediately. I want a complete record of Elena's maternal lineage, including any details surrounding the circumstances that led to her family's records being altered or removed." Aldrich bowed and departed swiftly to carry out the king's instructions, leaving Marisol standing alone near the doorway, her plans for controlling the narrative surrounding Elena's worth crumbling rapidly with each passing moment. She opened her mouth as though to offer further protest, but seeing the resolute expressions on both Cale and Elena's faces, seemed to finally recognize the futility of continued resistance. "This is not over," Marisol said instead, her voice carrying a bitter edge as she turned and swept from the antechamber, leaving behind a silence that felt, despite the uncertainty of what secrets the royal archives might reveal, strangely peaceful in her absence. Elena turned back to Cale, still trying to process the whirlwind of revelations unfolding around her. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I did not expect my family's history to become a source of complication for you." "Do not apologize for circumstances entirely beyond your control," Cale said firmly, reaching out to take her hand once more, his touch warm and reassuring, despite the uncertainty hanging over them both. "Whatever we discover about your mother's past, know that it changes nothing about how I feel standing here with you now. Together, we will uncover whatever truth has been hidden, and together, we will decide what it means for both our futures." Elena took her place at the end of the last row, her pulse still hammering from the run through the forest, and tried to steady her breathing before anyone around her noticed how out of place she looked among the composed, perfectly poised women surrounding her. To her left stood a woman in deep emerald silk, who did not so much as glance her way. To her right, a woman in gold thread fabric whispered something to her neighbor and laughed softly behind her veil. No one seemed to recognize the breathless, wind-blown newcomer who had slipped through the doors at the very last moment, and for that, Elena was grateful. At the front of the hall, seated upon the dark wood throne, Cale Draven watched the proceedings with an expression that gave nothing away. He was younger than most kings Elena had heard described in stories, his dark hair pushed back from a face that seemed carved from patience and control, his eyes a striking shade of amber that seemed to catch and hold the candlelight whenever he turned his head. He wore no crown, only a simple circlet of dark metal, as though he cared little for the trappings of his position, and much more for the substance of it. Rumors about him had traveled far beyond the palace walls. Some said he had never once shown affection toward any of the women presented to him in past ceremonies, that his instincts were so sharp and his standards so exacting that many believed he might never find a true mate at all. Others whispered that beneath his cold exterior was a man who had simply grown tired of being chosen for his title rather than himself, and who trusted nothing but the ancient pull of fate to guide him now. A steward with a deep, carrying voice called the ceremony to order, and the great hall fell into a hush so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. One by one, women were led forward from the front of the line, presented before the throne, and allowed a moment for the king to lean close, inhale softly, and make his judgment. Most were dismissed within seconds, a small shake of his head enough to send them gracefully back to their seats, disappointment carefully hidden behind practiced composure. A few lingered a moment longer, drawing a flicker of interest from the king before he shook his head anyway, unsatisfied by whatever he sensed, or failed to sense, in their presence. Elena watched this process unfold from a distance, fascinated despite her nerves. There was something almost sacred about the way Cale conducted himself, patient and unhurried, despite the sheer number of women waiting to be seen. He did not rush through the ceremony out of boredom or duty. He seemed, if anything, to be searching for something with quiet, persistent hope, even as rejection after rejection passed before him. It was somewhere near the middle of the ceremony that Elena felt a presence settle close beside her, too close to be accidental. She turned slightly and found herself looking at a woman in a deep rose-colored gown, whose posture radiated familiar, unmistakable superiority. Even veiled, Elena recognized her instantly by the way she carried her shoulders, by the particular tilt of her chin. It was Priya, Marisol's eldest daughter. "You should not be here," Priya whispered, her voice sharp, even through the thin fabric covering her face. "Mother locked you away for a reason. How did you even get past the gates?" Elena's stomach twisted with dread, but she forced herself to keep her voice low and even. "The decree said, every eligible woman of pack blood must attend. I am simply following the law, same as you." "You are making a fool of this family," Priya hissed. "Look at you, wearing that ridiculous gown, pretending you belong among women of real standing. If Mother sees you here, she will drag you out by your hair in front of the entire kingdom, and you will deserve every bit of the humiliation that follows." Elena's hands trembled at her sides, but she kept them still, refusing to let Priya see how deeply the threat had landed. "Then I suppose we will both find out what happens," she said quietly, "because I am not leaving." Priya's eyes narrowed behind her veil, and for a moment, Elena feared she might simply call out to the guards herself, might announce to the entire hall that an unlisted, uninvited woman had slipped into the ceremony under false pretenses. But before Priya could act, the steward's voice rang out again, calling the next group of women forward, and Priya was pulled away with the others in her row, throwing one last venomous glance over her shoulder as she went. Elena exhaled slowly, her heart still racing, and forced her attention back toward the front of the hall, where the king had just risen from his throne for the first time since the ceremony began. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena watched as Cale descended the few steps from the dais and approached the newest woman presented before him, someone from a well-known noble house near the eastern border, her gown a deep and expensive violet that spoke of old money and careful preparation. He leaned close, inhaled, and for one long moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this might finally be the one. Then he stepped back, shook his head once, and returned to his throne without a word. Disappointment rippled visibly through the crowd, though Cale's own expression remained unreadable. Elena found herself studying him more closely now, curious despite her nerves, wondering what exactly he was searching for, what invisible thread of fate he expected to feel, that none of these carefully prepared, beautifully dressed women had yet given him. As the evening wore on, and row after row was presented and dismissed, Elena felt the tension in the hall shifting subtly. Whispers grew a little louder between rejections. A few of the older nobles near the front began to exchange concerned glances, clearly wondering if this ceremony, like so many before it, might end without any resolution at all. Elena caught fragments of conversation drifting toward her from nearby guests, murmurs about the king's growing reputation for coldness, quiet speculation about what it might mean for the kingdom if their alpha continued to reign without a true mate at his side. She tried not to think too much about her own place in all of this. She was not here to be chosen. She was here because it was her right, as much as anyone else's. because for one night she had refused to let Marisol decide what she deserved. Whatever happened when her own row was finally called forward, whether the king glanced at her with mild curiosity and moved on exactly as he had with dozens of women before her, at least she would know she had stood there. At least she would know she had not let herself be erased. Still, as the rows ahead of hers grew steadily shorter, she felt an unfamiliar tightness building in her chest, something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but some strange tangle of both. She glanced down at the pale crescent mark on the inside of her wrist, mostly hidden now beneath the long sleeve of her mother's gown, and found herself thinking of Wren's words in the attic. She always told me that one day you would need it, and that when that day came, you would know. Elena did not know what she was supposed to feel tonight, but standing there in the golden candlelight, veiled among women whose birthrights had never once been questioned, she realized, with a small and startling clarity, that some quiet part of her had already begun to hope. Word of the ceremony's dramatic turn spread quickly through the capital, and by the time evening fell over the royal palace, whispers of the mysterious servant girl who had captured the king's attention had reached nearly every corner of the city. Elena remained within the palace at Cale's invitation, given a private chamber to rest while the royal archivists worked through the night, searching centuries of records for any trace of her mother's forgotten lineage. Elena sat by the window of her temporary chamber, still dressed in her mother's gown, though the veil had long since been removed, watching the lights of the capital flicker to life below as darkness settled over the city. She thought of Nora, wondering if word had reached her yet about the day's extraordinary events, and hoped desperately that Marisol's anger would not find some way to punish the loyal housekeeper for her role in helping Elena reach the ceremony. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and Elena rose to answer it, finding Cale standing in the corridor, his formal ceremonial attire replaced now with simpler, more comfortable clothing that made him seem, despite his position, remarkably approachable. "I hope I am not intruding," Cale said, offering a small, uncertain smile that seemed at odds with the confident authority he had displayed throughout the ceremony earlier that day. "Aldrich's team has uncovered something in the archives. I thought you would want to know immediately, rather than waiting until morning." Elena's heart quickened with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as she followed Cale down a series of quiet corridors toward the royal archive chamber, where Aldrich waited with several documents spread carefully across a long wooden table, illuminated by the soft glow of numerous candles. "What have you found?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she approached the table, studying the aged, yellowed parchments with growing curiosity. "Your mother's family," Aldrich began, his expression carrying a mixture of gravity and genuine sympathy, "belonged to a pack line known as the Ashworth family, one of the oldest and most respected lineages in this kingdom, dating back many generations before the current royal line even came to power." Elena felt her breath catch at the unfamiliar name, something in it stirring a faint, distant memory of her mother humming an old tune, one she had always claimed was simply a lullaby, but which suddenly felt like it might have carried deeper significance. "What happened to them?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why were they erased from the records?" Aldrich exchanged a brief glance with Cale before continuing. "There was a conflict, generations ago, between the Ashworth family and a rival pack seeking greater influence within the royal court. The details are somewhat unclear, obscured by time and deliberate efforts at concealment, but it appears the rival pack orchestrated a false accusation against the Ashworth line, claiming they had conspired against the crown itself." "A false accusation," Elena repeated, anger beginning to build within her chest at the injustice done to a family she had never even known existed. "They were innocent?" "The records suggest as much," Aldrich confirmed, pulling forward a particular document covered in careful faded handwriting. A journal entry from a royal advisor at the time expresses significant doubt about the accusations, suggesting the entire matter was fabricated to eliminate a rival family's growing influence. Unfortunately, the political climate of the era favored swift punishment over careful investigation, and the Ashworth family's standing was stripped entirely, their records erased from official registries as though they had never existed at all. Elena absorbed this information slowly, pieces of her mother's carefully guarded silence finally beginning to make sense. Her mother had grown up knowing her family had been wrongfully destroyed, their reputation and standing stolen through lies and political maneuvering, and had likely carried that painful knowledge silently for her entire life, protecting Elena from a truth too heavy and dangerous to share. "Why would my mother never tell me any of this?" Elena asked, more to herself than to either man standing beside her. "Perhaps she hoped to protect you," Cale suggested gently, "from carrying the weight of an injustice she herself never saw properly resolved. Or perhaps she feared that knowledge of your true lineage, without proper documentation to support it, might create more danger than protection in a world that had already proven capable of such cruelty toward her family." Elena nodded slowly, understanding the logic even as grief for a mother she had lost too young, and a family history she had never been allowed to know, settled heavily over her heart. "Is there any way to properly restore the Ashworth name?" she asked. "To correct this injustice, even after all this time?" "That decision would ultimately rest with the king," Aldrich said, glancing toward Cale with clear anticipation. Cale stepped closer to Elena, his expression resolute despite the late hour, and the weight of the discoveries they had just uncovered together. "I intend to restore your family's rightful standing," he said firmly. "Whatever political maneuvering occurred generations ago to destroy your mother's lineage, it was built upon lies, and I will not allow such injustice to remain unaddressed simply because time has passed." Relief and gratitude flooded through Elena at his words, though a new worry quickly followed close behind. "What of Marisol?" she asked. "She knew about my family's history, or at least suspected enough to use it against me. How did she come to possess such knowledge?" Cale's expression grew thoughtful. "That is a question worth investigating further," he agreed. "Though I suspect the answer may reveal even more about the circumstances surrounding your father's second marriage than either of us currently understands." As if summoned by the very mention of her name, a commotion sounded from the corridor outside the archive chamber, followed quickly by raised voices and the sound of hurried footsteps. Moments later, a palace guard appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Your Majesty," the guard said, bowing quickly, "forgive the intrusion, but the woman Marisol Voss is demanding an audience. She claims to possess information critical to tonight's matters, and insists it cannot wait until morning." Cale exchanged a glance with Elena, silently asking whether she felt prepared to face her stepmother again so soon after the day's overwhelming events. Elena straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the truth she had just learned about her mother's family, about the injustice that had shaped so much of her own difficult life, without her ever fully understanding why. "I am ready," Elena said firmly. "Whatever she has to say, I would rather hear it now, with the truth already established, than continue living beneath the shadow of her lies." Cale nodded, clearly proud of her resolve, and instructed the guard to bring Marisol to the archive chamber immediately. Moments later, Marisol swept into the room, her earlier fury replaced now with something more calculated, more desperate, as though she understood her previous approach had failed entirely, and a new strategy was urgently required. "Your Majesty," Marisol began, her voice carrying forced humility that did little to mask the underlying desperation. "I have come to explain certain matters more fully, in hopes that a complete understanding of the situation might change your current course of action." "We already know about the Ashworth family," Cale said evenly, watching Marisol's expression carefully for any sign of reaction. "We know the accusations against them were false, orchestrated by a rival pack seeking to eliminate their influence. What we do not yet understand is how you came to possess this knowledge, and why you chose to use it as a weapon against Elena rather than sharing the truth with her directly." Marisol's face paled slightly at this direct confrontation, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack under the weight of Cale's steady, unwavering gaze. "I learned of it through my own family's history," she admitted finally, her voice growing quieter. "My own mother spoke of the Ashworth scandal when I was young, warning me never to associate with anyone connected to that name, lest the taint of their fall from grace somehow affect my own standing. And when you learned that your late husband's first wife descended from this very family," Cale continued, his tone growing sharper, "you saw an opportunity, did you not? A way to ensure your own daughters faced no competition from a stepdaughter whose lineage, once properly investigated and restored, might have proven far more significant than your own." Marisol said nothing, her silence confirming the truth of Cale's accusation more clearly than any words could have managed. Elena watched her stepmother's carefully maintained mask finally crumble entirely, revealing years of calculated cruelty, rooted not simply in jealousy or spite, but in deliberate, strategic manipulation, designed to protect her own family's interests at Elena's expense. "You knew," Elena said softly, the full weight of the revelation settling over her. "All those years, you knew exactly who my mother's family truly was, and you deliberately hid that truth from me, using it instead to convince me I was worthless, unworthy of anything better than a servant's life in my own father's house." "I did what I believed was necessary," Marisol said, though even she seemed to recognize how hollow the justification sounded in the face of everything now exposed before them. "To protect my daughter's futures, to ensure this family's standing remained secure." "By destroying mine," Elena finished quietly, though for the first time in longer than she could remember, the words carried no bitterness, only quiet, clear-eyed understanding of exactly what had been done to her, and exactly what strength it had taken to survive it regardless. Across the hall, seated among the family boxes reserved for households with daughters presented that evening, Marisol shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd for what felt like the 10th time in the last hour. Something was wrong. She could not name it exactly, but a prickling unease had settled over her the moment the great doors sealed shut, a feeling she usually associated with plans slipping out of her control. Beside her sat Odette, watching the ceremony with mild boredom, occasionally fanning herself with a folded program listing the noble houses in attendance. Priya had returned from her row only minutes ago, her face pale and tight beneath her veil, refusing to answer when Marisol asked why she looked so unsettled. "Priya," Marisol whispered sharply, leaning close. "What is it? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Priya hesitated, glancing toward the far end of the hall, where the last rows of women still waited their turn. "Mother," she said quietly, "I think Elena is here." Marisol's expression froze. For a long moment, she simply stared at her daughter, waiting for the words to make sense in some way that did not threaten everything she had spent the evening arranging. "That is not possible," she said finally, her voice low and controlled despite the anger already building beneath it. "I locked her in the cellar myself. She has no carriage, no escort, and no gown fit for a night like this." "I saw her," Priya insisted. "Or someone wearing her mother's old gown, at least. She is standing near the back, in the last row. I spoke to her myself." Marisol's jaw tightened, and for the first time that evening, the composed mask she wore in public slipped just slightly, revealing the sharp, calculating fury underneath. She had worked for years to bury any trace of Elena's mother's family, to make certain that the girl grew up believing she was nothing more than an unwanted burden, with no claim to anything beyond the scraps of charity Marisol chose to extend her. If Elena had somehow found her mother's ceremonial gown, if she had somehow made her way here despite every obstacle placed in her path, then someone in that household had betrayed Marisol's explicit instructions. "Find out how she got here," Marisol said quietly, her voice dangerously calm. "And find out who helped her. Someone will answer for this." Odette, sensing the shift in her mother's mood, finally looked up from her fan with genuine interest. "Does it matter?" she asked. "The king has rejected nearly every woman presented so far. He will reject her too, and it will be over quickly. Let her have her moment of foolishness. It changes nothing." Marisol did not answer immediately. She turned her gaze back toward the front of the hall, watching as another woman was presented and dismissed within seconds, the king's expression as unreadable as it had been all evening. Odette was likely right. The odds that Cale Draven would show any interest in a girl Marisol had spent years convincing was unworthy of attention seemed impossibly small. And yet the unease in her chest refused to settle. Some instinct she could not quite name, whispering that tonight was not going to unfold the way she expected. Near the front of the hall, unnoticed by the distracted family in the noble boxes, a tall steward in dark formal robes stood a respectful distance from the throne, watching the proceedings with far more attention than his position typically required. His name was Corwin, and he had served as the king's closest advisor and confidant since Cale's coronation 5 years earlier. Unlike most of the attendants and guards stationed throughout the hall, Corwin possessed a keen sensitivity to the subtle currents of magic that moved through gatherings like this one. currents most people could not perceive at all. He had felt something shift in the atmosphere of the hall nearly an hour ago, a faint disturbance so subtle he had almost dismissed it as imagination. But it had not faded. If anything, it had grown steadily stronger as the evening wore on, a quiet hum of old magic threading through the golden candlelight, like a note held just beneath the range of ordinary hearing. Corwin had spent years studying the ancient bloodlines of the kingdom's founding pack families whose magic had grown rare and diluted over generations of intermarriage and quiet extinction. He recognized this particular resonance, though he could not immediately place its source among the rows of veiled women still waiting to be presented. He glanced toward Cale, wondering if the king had noticed it too, and found his answer in the subtle tension along Cale's jaw, the way his amber eyes had begun scanning the remaining rows with far more focus than his earlier weary patience had suggested. Something had caught the king's attention, something Corwin suspected neither man could yet name with certainty. "Your Majesty," Corwin said quietly, stepping closer to the throne during a brief pause between presentations. "Do you feel it as well?" Cale did not look at him immediately. His gaze remained fixed toward the back of the hall, toward the last remaining rows of women who had not yet been called forward. "I do not know what it is," he admitted, his voice low enough that only Corwin could hear. "But something in this hall feels different tonight. I felt it the moment the doors closed for the final time." Corwin followed the direction of the king's gaze, studying the distant rows with narrowed eyes, searching for any visible sign of what might be causing the disturbance. He saw nothing unusual at first glance, only ordinary women in ordinary finery, waiting nervously for their turn before the throne. But magic, true old magic, rarely announced itself so plainly. It hid in small details, in the particular weave of a fabric, in a mark passed down through generations, and forgotten by everyone except the blood that carried it. "Perhaps," Corwin said carefully, "tonight will not end, the way the last several ceremonies have ended." Cale said nothing in response, but something in his expression, some faint and cautious flicker of hope he had not allowed himself to feel in years, told Corwin that the king suspected the same thing. Meanwhile, near the back of the hall, Elena remained unaware of the quiet attention gathering around her from multiple directions at once. She kept her eyes forward, her hands folded carefully in front of her, trying to steady the nervous energy building in her chest as her row inched closer and closer to the front of the line. 2 more rows stood between her and the dais, then 1. She could see the throne clearly now, could make out the king's features in sharper detail than before, the strong line of his jaw, the intensity of his focus as he studied each woman presented before him. She thought, briefly, of turning back, of slipping quietly toward the rear exit and disappearing into the night, before anyone could question how she had arrived, or challenge her right to stand among the other candidates. The fear of public humiliation, of standing before the entire kingdom, only to be dismissed within seconds, like so many women before her, pressed heavily against her resolve. But then she thought of the cellar, of the bolt sliding shut, of years spent believing she deserved nothing better than the scraps of attention Marisol chose to give her. She thought of her mother's gown, warm and glowing faintly even now beneath the candlelight, a gift left behind by a woman Elena had never truly known but who had, somehow, prepared her for exactly this moment. She would not run. Whatever happened next, she would stand her ground and let it happen in full view of everyone who had ever told her she was not enough. Her row moved forward one final time, and Elena found herself standing at the very edge of the crimson carpet, close enough now to see the flicker of candlelight reflected in the king's amber eyes as he turned, for the first time all evening, to look directly toward the back of the hall. The silence that followed Elena's words stretched long and heavy through the archive chamber, broken only by the soft crackling of candles burning low in their holders. Marisol stood motionless, her carefully constructed defenses finally exhausted, while Cale watched the exchange with quiet, protective attention, ready to intervene should Marisol attempt any further manipulation. "What do you intend to do now?" Marisol asked finally, her voice smaller than Elena had ever heard it, stripped of its usual sharp authority. Cale stepped forward, his expression stern but controlled. "That decision belongs to Elena," he said firmly. "You have caused significant harm through years of deliberate cruelty and deception. Whatever consequences follow will be determined according to the law, but I will not pretend the choice of how to proceed does not, in some measure, belong to the person you have wronged most directly. All eyes turned toward Elena, who found herself considering the question carefully, rather than responding with the immediate anger she might have expected herself to feel in this moment. Years of suppressed hurt, of swallowed words and quiet endurance, churned within her, but beneath that pain, something steadier had begun to take root over the past few days, something that felt closer to clarity than vengeance. "I do not wish for cruelty in return," Elena said slowly, her voice growing more certain as she spoke. "I have lived under cruelty for years, and I have no desire to become the kind of person who inflicts it upon others, regardless of how deeply I have been wronged. But I will not pretend nothing happened, and I will not allow the truth to remain hidden any longer, for my own sake, and for the sake of correcting an injustice that has lasted far too long." Cale nodded slowly, clear approval evident in his expression, though he remained silent, allowing Elena the full authority to determine the path forward. "The Ashworth name will be formally restored," Elena continued, turning her attention toward Aldrich, who nodded in confirmation of his readiness to carry out whatever official process such restoration required. "The truth of what happened to my mother's family, generations ago, deserves to be known, not buried any longer beneath lies and political convenience. As for you," Elena said, finally turning her full attention back to Marisol, who visibly braced herself for whatever judgment might follow, "you will no longer hold any claim over my father's estate or his remaining assets. Whatever legal arrangements existed through your marriage to him will be reviewed and adjusted to reflect the truth of everything that has occurred within that household since his passing." Marisol's face tightened at this pronouncement, though she said nothing in protest, clearly recognizing the futility of further argument in the face of Cale's evident support for whatever Elena decided. "Bianca and Diane," Elena continued, her voice softening slightly as she considered her stepsisters, who, despite their own unkindness over the years, had ultimately been shaped by their mother's calculated cruelty, rather than acting entirely from their own independent malice. "They will not be punished for their mother's actions. Whatever choices they make going forward, I hope they might choose a different path than the one modeled for them throughout their childhood." Cale studied Elena carefully as she spoke, something like quiet admiration evident in his expression at the measured fairness of her judgment, the way she balanced justice with compassion, even toward those who had caused her significant harm. "This is more mercy than I deserve," Marisol admitted quietly, some genuine humility finally breaking through her earlier desperation. "I will not pretend to fully understand why you would extend such grace toward me, after everything I have done. Because I refuse to let your cruelty define who I choose to become," Elena said simply. "I spent years believing your words about my worth, my appearance, my place in the world. I will not spend the rest of my life allowing your actions to determine the kind of person I am now capable of becoming." Aldrich stepped forward respectfully, addressing Cale directly. "Your Majesty, shall I begin the formal proceedings to restore the Ashworth lineage immediately?" "Yes," Cale confirmed, "and ensure the full truth of the original false accusations is properly documented and shared throughout the kingdom, so that history remembers accurately what occurred to this family generations ago." As Aldrich departed to begin the necessary preparations, Cale turned his attention to the palace guard still waiting near the doorway. "Please escort Marisol to appropriate accommodations within the palace for the remainder of the evening," he instructed. "We will finalize the details of the estate adjustments in the morning, once everyone has had adequate time to rest and properly consider the events of this remarkable day." Marisol nodded silently, offering one final glance toward Elena, an expression Elena could not quite interpret, somewhere between resentment and something that might, with enough time and reflection, eventually grow into genuine regret. She followed the guard from the chamber without further protest, leaving Elena and Cale alone once more, amid the flickering candlelight and scattered ancient documents. "You handled that with remarkable grace," Cale said softly, once the sound of Marisol's footsteps had faded completely from the corridor outside. "Many in your position would have sought far harsher consequences, and few would have judged you unfairly for doing so." "I considered it," Elena admitted honestly, "but I realized that seeking her suffering would not undo my own. It would simply add more pain to a situation already burdened with far too much of it already." Cale reached out gently, taking her hand in his once more, his thumb tracing a soft, comforting pattern across her knuckles. "Your mother would be extraordinarily proud of the woman you have become," he said quietly, not simply because of the strength you showed in surviving such difficult circumstances, but because of the compassion you continue to demonstrate even now, when every reason exists to abandon such kindness entirely. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes once more, though these carried none of the sorrow or bitterness of years past, only the quiet, overwhelming relief of finally being seen, finally being understood, finally standing in a space where her worth was recognized, not despite her difficult history, but because of the character that history had ultimately revealed within her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me, even before you fully understood any of this." "I did not simply believe in you," Cale corrected gently, his expression carrying quiet, unwavering certainty. "From the very first moment I stood before you in that hall, something within me recognized you completely, beyond appearances, beyond circumstances, beyond anything that could be explained through logic or reason alone. I recognized who you truly are, Elena Voss, soon to be Elena Ashworth once more, and I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life." Outside the tall windows of the archive chamber, the moon hung high and bright over the sleeping capital, casting silver light across the ancient documents, spread carefully upon the table. Documents that would soon rewrite generations of hidden history, restoring truth and dignity to a family long since erased from memory, while inside the quiet chamber, two people who had found each other against every conceivable expectation stood together, hands joined, hearts steady, ready to face whatever remarkable future now awaited them both. The women ahead of Elena's row were called forward, one at a time, and with each passing minute, the distance between her and the throne shrank until she could hear the soft rustle of fabric as each candidate stepped onto the crimson carpet, could hear the faint intake of breath as Cale leaned close to each of them in turn. None of them lingered long, the pattern held steady, familiar and almost mechanical by now, a brief pause, followed by a small shake of the head, and a quiet return to the seated rows. Priya, several places ahead of Elena in a different section, was called forward during this stretch. Elena watched with a strange knot of tension in her chest as Cale approached her stepsister, leaned in briefly, and then stepped back within seconds, his expression as unreadable as it had been with every other woman that evening. Priya returned to her seat with her chin held high, though Elena suspected the rejection stung more than her stepsister would ever admit aloud. Two women ahead of Elena now. She could feel her pulse quickening, her palms damp beneath the delicate embroidered sleeves of her mother's gown. She tried to steady her breathing the way her father had once taught her when she was young and frightened of thunderstorms. Slow counts in, slower counts out, until the shaking in her hands eased just slightly. One woman ahead of her now, a noble woman in deep sapphire silk, who carried herself with the practiced confidence of someone who had attended a dozen ceremonies before this one. Elena watched as she was presented, as Cale leaned close, and for one brief moment, something flickered across his expression that had not appeared with any of the previous candidates. He paused a beat longer than usual, his brow furrowing slightly, before ultimately shaking his head and stepping back. The woman's shoulders sagged, almost imperceptibly, as she returned to her seat. And then it was Elena's turn. The steward's voice called for the final candidate in the row, and for one terrifying moment, Elena's legs refused to move. Every eye in the section nearest her seemed to turn in her direction, curious about the unfamiliar woman who had appeared so suddenly among the other candidates, whispers rippling faintly through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. She forced herself forward, one step and then another, until she stood at the edge of the crimson carpet, the full length of the great hall stretching before her, candlelight blurring at the edges of her vision as her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She walked the carpet slowly, deliberately, refusing to let her nerves show in her stride even as her stomach twisted painfully with every step. Somewhere behind her, in the noble boxes reserved for attending families, she heard a sharp intake of breath that could only have come from Marisol, who had finally spotted her among the candidates being presented. Elena did not turn to look. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the throne, on the king rising slowly from his seat as she approached, his expression unlike anything she had seen him wear with any of the previous candidates. There was no boredom in his posture now, no weary patience worn thin by hours of disappointment. He watched her approach with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. She stopped at the designated mark on the carpet, exactly as every woman before her had done, and lowered her eyes respectfully, waiting for the brief moment of consideration that would inevitably end in dismissal, just as it had for every other candidate that evening. But Cale did not step forward immediately, the way he had with the others. He remained still for a long moment, studying her from a distance. His amber eyes narrowed slightly, as though he were trying to make sense of something he could not quite explain. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath along with him, sensing that something unusual was unfolding, though no one could yet say exactly what it was. Corwin, standing near the dais, felt the faint hum of magic he had noticed earlier, sharpened suddenly into something unmistakable, a resonance so clear now that he wondered how he had failed to identify its source sooner. He glanced toward Cale and saw his own realization mirrored in the king's expression. Cautious disbelief, mixed with something that looked almost like hope, finally daring to surface after years of careful restraint. "Approach," Cale said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall despite its low volume. Elena stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between them, until she stood directly before the throne, close enough now to see the fine details of his features clearly for the first time, the sharp line of his jaw, the faint scar along his temple that spoke of battles fought long before his coronation, the quiet, restrained intensity in his gaze that made her pulse race even faster than it already had. He did not lean close the way he had with every other candidate that evening. Instead, he simply breathed in, slowly, deliberately, and something in his expression shifted entirely, the careful neutrality he had maintained all night finally cracking, to reveal genuine, unguarded surprise. "What is your name?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she and those nearest the dais could hear it clearly. "Elena," she answered, her voice trembling only slightly despite the pounding of her heart. "Elena Voss." Something about the name seemed to catch him off guard, though Elena could not begin to guess why. He studied her for another long moment, his gaze moving briefly to the pale crescent mark just visible at the edge of her sleeve, where it had slipped slightly during her earlier run through the forest. His expression sharpened with sudden, focused attention. Behind Elena, murmurs had begun rippling steadily through the crowd, curious whispers rising in volume, as onlookers registered that something unprecedented was happening at the front of the hall. Marisol had risen halfway from her seat in the noble box, her face pale with a mixture of shock and fury, though she did not yet dare interrupt the ceremony openly. Cale descended the final step from his throne, closing the last small distance between himself and Elena until he stood directly before her, near enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool air of the vast hall. He reached toward her veil with careful, deliberate hands, breaking with the tradition Elena had understood all evening, the tradition that required each candidate to remove her own veil, only when the king formally requested it. He did not wait for permission. He did not need to. His fingers brushed the delicate fabric with a gentleness that surprised her, and slowly, deliberately, he lifted the veil away from her face, revealing her features fully to him, and to the entire silent, watching hall for the first time that evening. 3 months passed following that extraordinary night in the royal archives, months filled with careful preparation, formal ceremonies, and the slow, steady process of rebuilding a life Elena had never imagined she would be given the chance to reclaim. The Ashworth name had been formally restored throughout the kingdom, the truth of the generations-old betrayal documented and shared widely enough that even the most skeptical nobles had come to accept the legitimacy of Elena's rightful lineage. Nora had been brought to live permanently within the palace grounds, given a position of honor and comfort in recognition of her years of quiet loyalty, and the crucial role she had played in helping Elena reach the ceremony that had changed everything. Wren, too, had become a frequent visitor to the palace, her friendship with Elena deepening now that the constraints of their previous circumstances no longer stood between them. Marisol, true to Elena's earlier decision, had faced consequences appropriate to her actions, without cruelty attached to their execution. She had lost her claim to Elena's father's estate, though she retained enough resources to live modestly, a stark contrast to the luxurious lifestyle she had once enjoyed at Elena's expense. Bianca and Diane, freed from their mother's constant manipulation, had begun, slowly and imperfectly, to reconsider the values instilled in them throughout their childhood, occasionally sending Elena brief, hesitant letters that suggested genuine, if gradual, growth. On a bright morning in early autumn, the royal palace prepared for another grand ceremony, though this one carried none of the uncertainty or tension of the mating ceremony months before. Elena stood in a private chamber overlooking the palace gardens, dressed once more in her mother's midnight blue gown, though it had since been carefully restored and enhanced by the finest seamstresses in the kingdom, the silver embroidery along its edges, now shimmering with additional detail that honored both its original beauty and the significance of the moment it would witness. "You look radiant," Nora said, adjusting the delicate veil Elena would wear one final time, though today it would be lifted not by uncertainty and fear, but by joyful anticipation of a future both Elena and Cale had spent months carefully building together. "I could not have imagined this moment, even a year ago," Elena admitted, studying her reflection in the tall mirror before her, hardly recognizing the confident, radiant woman staring back at her, though she knew, deep within her heart, that this person had always existed beneath the surface, simply waiting for the chance to finally emerge. "Your mother is watching over you today," Nora said softly, squeezing Elena's hand gently. "I have no doubt of that." A knock sounded at the door, and Wren entered, dressed elegantly for the occasion, her expression bright with excitement. "The hall is filled beyond capacity," she reported, practically bouncing with anticipation. "Nobles from every corner of the kingdom have gathered to witness this. Elena, everyone wishes to see the ceremony that will formally bond you and King Cale before the entire realm." Elena felt a familiar flutter of nervous anticipation, though it carried none of the fear that had accompanied her into the grand hall those many months before. This time, she walked toward her future not as an uncertain, hidden servant, seeking merely the chance to be seen, but as Elena Ashworth, a woman whose worth had been recognized, whose family's honor had been restored, and whose heart had found, against every conceivable expectation, a genuine and lasting connection with someone who valued her completely for who she truly was. The procession toward the grand hall passed in a blur of warm well-wishes and excited whispers from palace staff and visiting dignitaries alike, until finally Elena found herself standing once more before those same towering doors that had, months earlier, opened onto a day that changed her entire existence. This time, when the doors swung open, she was not one of hundreds of veiled candidates standing anxiously in a long procession. She walked alone, her steps steady and sure, down a long aisle lined with cheering nobles and pack members, toward a raised dais where Cale waited, dressed in formal ceremonial attire, his expression carrying a warmth and joy that had nothing to do with royal duty, and everything to do with genuine, deeply felt love. As Elena approached, she caught sight of familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Aldrich stood near the dais, his expression carrying quiet pride. Nora and Wren had taken seats near the front, both dabbing at happy tears as Elena passed. Even Bianca and Diane had been invited to attend, seated respectfully near the back of the hall, their expressions carrying something that looked, remarkably, like genuine happiness for the stepsister they had once dismissed so carelessly. Elena reached the dais, and Cale stepped forward to meet her, taking her hands in his with the same gentle warmth he had shown from that very first moment months ago, when he had lifted her veil and recognized, instantly and completely, the truth of who she was beneath years of imposed cruelty and doubt. "Elena Ashworth," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent, attentive hall. "Months ago, I stood before hundreds of hopeful candidates, searching for a connection I had waited my entire life to discover. Fate led me to you, not through wealth or status or appearance, but through something far deeper and more meaningful, a recognition of character and strength that no amount of hardship could ever diminish." He reached up gently and lifted the veil from her face, though this time, the gesture carried none of the tension or uncertainty of their first meeting, only pure, unshadowed joy at finally being able to see clearly the woman who had transformed his understanding of what it truly meant to find a fated partner. "Before this entire kingdom," Cale continued, his amber eyes bright with emotion, "I declare you my chosen mate, my equal in every sense, and soon, my queen. Together, we will build a future defined not by inherited privilege or superficial judgment, but by the genuine strength, compassion, and resilience you have shown throughout every difficult chapter of your life." The hall erupted into joyful applause, hundreds of voices rising together in celebration of a union that had captured the imagination and admiration of the entire kingdom. A story that would be told for generations to come, of a young woman once dismissed as too plain, too poor, too forgettable, who had ultimately proven herself worthy, not through some external transformation, but through the simple, unwavering strength of character she had carried within her all along. Elena looked out across the sea of celebrating faces, at Nora's proud tears, at Ren's beaming smile, at even Bianca and Diane's tentative but genuine happiness, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, the culmination of a journey that had tested every ounce of her endurance and ultimately revealed a strength she had never fully recognized within herself. "I love you," Cale said quietly, meant only for her ears, despite the surrounding celebration. Not because fate decreed it, but because every day since that ceremony, you have shown me exactly why that connection was always meant to exist between us. "I love you too," Elena replied, her voice steady and certain, carrying none of the doubt or fear that had once defined so much of her life. "Thank you for seeing me, truly seeing me, when everyone else had convinced themselves I deserved to remain invisible." As the celebration continued around them, the golden afternoon light streaming through the grand hall's towering windows, Elena allowed herself, finally and completely, to embrace the extraordinary reality of her new life. The girl who had once been locked in a cellar, dismissed as too ugly to attend a single ceremony, now stood as queen, before an entire kingdom, her true worth recognized, not through the lifting of a simple veil, but through the courage it had taken to insist upon her own rightful place in a world that had tried, for years, to convince her she did not deserve to be seen at all. And as the bells of the capital rang out joyfully across the kingdom, announcing to every corner of the realm that their new queen had been formally chosen, Elena understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that every difficult year, every moment of doubt, every quiet act of endurance had ultimately led her exactly where she was always meant to be, standing beside a man who loved her completely, surrounded by people who had never stopped believing in her true worth, finally and forever free, to become the woman she had always been destined to become. The great hall fell utterly silent as the veil slipped away from Elena's face, silent enough that the soft rustle of fabric settling against her shoulders seemed almost thunderous in the stillness. Every eye in the room fixed on the scene unfolding at the front of the hall, on the king standing close before an unfamiliar woman, whose identity no one present, apart from a small and furious handful, could readily explain. Cale studied her features with an intensity that made Elena's breath catch somewhere in her chest. She had spent years believing, because Marisol had told her so many times that the words had worn themselves into something close to fact, that her face held nothing worth noticing, that she was plain, in a way that made her easy to overlook and easier still to dismiss. But the way Cale looked at her now held no trace of dismissal in it. His amber eyes moved over her features slowly, carefully, as though he were memorizing something he had feared he might never find. "You," he said quietly, and there was a rough, unsteady quality to his voice that Elena had not heard from him during any of the earlier presentations. "You are the reason the hall has felt different all evening." Elena did not know how to respond. She had expected many possible outcomes when she finally reached the front of that carpet, quiet dismissal chief among them, but she had not prepared herself for this, for the king of the realm looking at her as though she were something precious and long searched for, rather than something unwanted and easily overlooked. Behind her, the murmurs in the crowd had grown louder, no longer able to contain their curiosity and confusion. Somewhere among the noise, Elena heard Marisol's voice rising sharply above the others, though the words themselves were lost in the general commotion. Cale seemed entirely unbothered by the growing noise around them. His attention remained fixed on Elena alone, as though the rest of the hall had simply ceased to exist the moment her veil lifted away. "Do you feel it?" he asked quietly, studying her expression closely. "The pull. It is unlike anything I have felt with any candidate before you, tonight, or in any ceremony before this one." Elena hesitated, uncertain how to describe the strange warmth spreading through her chest, the way her pulse seemed to synchronize itself with some rhythm she could not name, the odd, undeniable sense of recognition settling over her despite having never laid eyes on this man before tonight. "I feel something," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know what to call it." "Fate," Corwin said quietly from where he stood near the dais, stepping forward with careful, measured steps. His eyes remained fixed on Elena, with an intensity that mirrored the king's own, though his focus seemed centered specifically on the faint crescent mark visible at her wrist. "Your Majesty, if I may." Cale nodded once, granting permission without taking his eyes off Elena. Corwin approached and gently, respectfully, lifted Elena's wrist to examine the pale mark more closely, his brow furrowing with an expression that mixed astonishment with something that looked almost like reverence. "This mark," Corwin said slowly, glancing up toward Cale, "belongs to a bloodline nearly erased from the kingdom's records. I have only ever seen it described in old texts, generations old, referencing a founding pack family, whose line was believed extinguished decades ago." He turned his attention back to Elena, his voice gentler now. "Where did you come by this mark, child?" "I was born with it," Elena answered, glancing down at her own wrist as though seeing it clearly for the first time. "My mother had one just like it, or so I was told. She died when I was born. I never knew her myself." Before Corwin could respond, a sharp, furious voice cut through the hall, silencing the surrounding murmurs entirely. "This is absurd!" Marisol declared, striding forward from the noble box with Priya and Odette trailing uncertainly behind her. "That girl has no right to stand before the throne tonight. She was not properly presented." She arrived uninvited, wearing a gown that does not belong to her, disrupting a sacred ceremony with lies and theatrics. Cale turned toward Marisol with an expression that had shifted, in the span of a single sentence, from careful warmth back into the cold, unreadable authority Elena had witnessed throughout the earlier presentations. "And you are?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to still whatever momentum Marisol's outburst had carried with it. "Marisol Voss," she answered, straightening her posture, despite the sudden uncertainty flickering across her features. "That girl's stepmother. I can assure you, Your Majesty, that she is not who she appears to be tonight. She has no standing, no proper lineage worth the crown's attention. Whatever strange trick she has managed to pull off, I urge you not to be deceived by it." Cale's gaze moved slowly from Marisol to Elena and back again, and something in his expression hardened further with each passing second. "The mark on her wrist," he said evenly, "belongs to a bloodline my own advisor has just identified as one of the founding pack families of this kingdom. Tell me, Lady Voss, how does an uninvited, unworthy girl come to carry an inheritance like that, if everything you claim about her is true?" Marisol's mouth opened and then closed again, her carefully composed expression faltering for the first time that evening. Whatever answer she might have offered seemed to catch somewhere in her throat, unable to find its way past the sudden realization that her carefully constructed story about Elena's worthlessness had just collided directly with something she could not easily explain away. "I do not know what she has told you," Marisol said finally, her voice regaining some of its former sharpness, even as uncertainty flickered beneath it. "But whatever claims she is making about her lineage, they are exaggerations at best, and outright fabrications at worst. She was raised in my household as a servant more than a daughter. Ask anyone who has visited our home. She has no title, no dowry, and no place standing here tonight." Elena felt something inside her, something that had spent years shrinking under the weight of exactly this kind of dismissal, finally straighten and hold firm. "I was raised as a servant," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the silent hall, "because you made certain of it. You locked me in a cellar tonight to keep me from attending a ceremony required by royal decree. I did not lie about anything. I simply refused to disappear the way you wanted me to." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the watching crowd. Cale's expression, already hardened toward Marisol, sharpened further at Elena's words, and Corwin's eyes narrowed with something that looked distinctly like suspicion, aimed squarely at the woman standing before them. "You locked her away," Cale repeated slowly, each word carrying a quiet, controlled fury that made even the surrounding guards shift uneasily at their posts. "On the night of a mandatory royal ceremony, you imprisoned a legitimate candidate in your own household to prevent her from attending." Marisol's face had gone pale, the confident authority she had carried into the hall crumbling visibly under the weight of the king's attention. "Your Majesty, I only meant to spare her the embarrassment of—" "Enough," Cale said, his voice cutting through her explanation with a finality that left no room for further argument. He turned back toward Elena, and though his expression remained serious, something softer flickered beneath the surface when his eyes met hers again. "Whatever explanation your stepmother intends to offer, It will wait. Tonight, in front of this entire hall, I am declaring what my instincts have already told me the moment your veil lifted." He paused, glancing briefly at Corwin, who gave a small, encouraging nod. "Elena Voss, whatever name your mother's bloodline once carried before, it was nearly forgotten by this kingdom. You are the one fate has chosen for me." The declaration landed across the hall like a struck bell, its echo rippling outward through stunned silence, before breaking into a swell of astonished whispers. Elena stood frozen at the center of it all, scarcely able to process the weight of what Cale had just said in front of the entire assembled kingdom. She had come to this ceremony expecting nothing beyond the simple right to stand and be counted among the eligible women of the realm. She had not allowed herself to imagine anything beyond that small, defiant victory. Marisol's composure shattered entirely. "This is impossible," she said, her voice rising with a desperation that cut through the murmuring crowd. "Your Majesty, you cannot possibly mean to choose her. She has nothing. No dowry, no proper education in courtly matters, no family name worth speaking of, beyond what little her father left behind before he died. My own daughters were raised specifically to serve at your side, trained since childhood in exactly the graces a queen requires. And yet," Cale said evenly, "neither of your daughters carries the mark my advisor has just identified, nor the resonance that drew my attention the moment this hall's doors closed for the final time tonight. Fate does not concern itself with training or dowries, Lady Voss. It concerns itself with truth." Priya stepped forward hesitantly, glancing between her mother and the throne with an expression caught somewhere between loyalty and dawning uncertainty. "Mother," she said quietly, "perhaps we should." "Be silent," Marisol snapped, not bothering to look at her daughter. Her attention remained locked on Elena, her eyes narrowing with a fury that had abandoned any pretense of composure. "You planned this," she said, her voice low and venomous now. "Somehow, you planned this entire humiliation." "I planned nothing," Elena said steadily, refusing to let the accusation shake the fragile confidence she had built over the course of the evening. "I ran through a forest in the dark because you locked me in a cellar. I arrived breathless and uninvited because you tried to erase me from a ceremony I had every legal right to attend. Whatever has happened since then is not something either of us planned. It simply happened, because for the first time, you were not able to stop it." Cale watched this exchange with careful, measured attention, and though his expression remained largely composed, something in the set of his jaw suggested his patience with Marisol was wearing dangerously thin. He raised a hand slightly, and the two guards stationed nearest the throne stepped forward, flanking Marisol with quiet, deliberate authority. "Lady Voss," Cale said, his tone formal now, edged with the weight of royal command, "you have admitted, in front of witnesses, to unlawfully confining a legitimate candidate on the night of a mandatory ceremony. This is not a minor offense. The decree governing tonight's proceedings carries the full authority of the crown, and interfering with it is a crime taken seriously in this kingdom." Marisol's face drained of what little color remained in it. "Your Majesty, I only sought to protect my family's reputation. Surely that is not a crime worth—" "Reputation," Cale repeated, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the silent hall, "built on the suppression of a legitimate heir to a founding bloodline, is not reputation worth protecting. It is precisely the kind of injustice this crown exists to correct." Odette, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice smaller and less certain than Elena had ever heard it. "Mother," she said quietly, "what does he mean? A founding bloodline? Elena's mother was never spoken of. You always said she came from nothing." Marisol did not answer. Her silence, more than any words could have managed, seemed to confirm every uncertain suspicion beginning to form among the onlookers gathered throughout the hall. Corwin, who had remained near Elena's side throughout the confrontation, stepped forward once more, his expression thoughtful and increasingly troubled. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, addressing Cale directly, "if I may, I believe this matter deserves more thorough investigation than we can conduct here, in front of the full court. The bloodline this mark represents was believed extinguished under circumstances that were never fully explained in the historical record. If Lady Voss possesses knowledge relevant to that history, it may prove significant beyond tonight's ceremony." Cale considered this for a long moment, his gaze moving from Corwin to Marisol, whose expression had shifted from fury into something closer to panic, before finally settling once more on Elena. "Agreed," he said. Lady Voss will be escorted to the palace for formal questioning regarding her knowledge of the Voss and the founding bloodlines connected to it. Tonight is not the night for further public confrontation. Tonight belongs to something far more important than old grievances. He turned back toward Elena then, and the hardened authority in his expression softened once more, into something gentler, something that made Elena's breath catch despite everything unfolding around them. "I understand this is a great deal to absorb in a single evening," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her alone, despite the crowd still watching every movement between them. "You did not come here tonight, expecting any of this, but I would ask you, if you are willing, to remain, and allow me the chance to properly know the woman fate has placed before me." Elena glanced past him, toward Marisol being led carefully but firmly toward a side chamber by the two guards, toward Priya and Odette, standing uncertain and shaken, near the empty family box, toward the hundreds of watching faces filling the vast hall around them. Everything about her life had shifted irrevocably in the span of a single evening, and she had not yet begun to understand the full shape of what that shift would mean. But when she looked back at Cale, at the quiet sincerity in his expression, at the strange and undeniable warmth still humming faintly beneath her skin, wherever his attention rested on her, she found that her answer required no hesitation at all. "I am willing," she said quietly. "I would like to know you as well." The formal questioning took place 2 days later, in a quiet chamber within the palace, lined with tall shelves of old records, and lit by soft afternoon light, filtering through narrow windows. Elena sat across a long wooden table from Corwin, who had spent the previous day and night poring over archives, searching for any surviving trace of her mother's family. Cale sat beside her, close enough that his presence steadied the nervous energy still humming beneath her skin, though he said little, content to let Corwin guide the conversation. "Your mother's name was Lyra," Corwin said, laying a weathered document carefully on the table before them. "But before she married your father, she carried a different name entirely. Lyra Ashgrove, daughter of the Ashgrove line, one of the 7 founding pack families that helped establish this kingdom generations ago." Elena stared at the document, at faded ink spelling out a name she had never once heard spoken aloud in her entire life. "My father never mentioned this," she said quietly. "He spoke of her often, but never of any family beyond the 2 of them. That is likely because he did not know the full truth himself," Corwin said gently. "The Ashgrove line was formally erased from the kingdom's official records almost 25 years ago, following an incident the crown at the time chose to bury rather than fully investigate. Public records state simply that the family line ended, with no surviving heirs. But she survived," Elena said. "My mother survived, and she had me." "She did," Corwin confirmed, "which means someone worked very deliberately to ensure the kingdom believed otherwise." Cale leaned forward slightly, his expression darkening with quiet, focused attention. "You suspect this was not simple misfortune?" "I suspect," Corwin said carefully, "that it was arranged. The Ashgrove family held significant influence within the kingdom's council decades ago, influence that made them a political obstacle to at least one rival house seeking greater power. If that rival house orchestrated circumstances that led the crown to believe the Ashgrove line extinct, it would have cleared considerable political ground for their own ambitions." Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warm afternoon light filling the chamber. "You are saying someone destroyed my mother's family on purpose?" "I am saying it deserves far more thorough investigation than the official record currently reflects," Corwin said, "and I believe, given recent events, that investigation should begin without delay." Cale's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing visibly beneath his composed exterior. "Which house do you suspect?" Corwin hesitated, glancing briefly toward Elena before answering. "The records from that period are incomplete, deliberately so in places that suggest someone worked to obscure them further after the fact. But one name appears repeatedly in connection with the council proceedings that led to the Ashgrove line's erasure. House Thornberry." The name meant nothing to Elena, but she noticed the subtle shift in Cale's expression at the mention of it, a flicker of recognition mixed with something closer to wariness. "Duke Aldrich Thornberry sits on my council," Cale said slowly. "He has served the crown for over a decade, inherited his position from his father before him." "Precisely," Corwin said, "which means if my suspicions are correct, the man responsible for erasing an entire founding bloodline from this kingdom's history may still hold significant influence within your own court, Your Majesty. The weight of that possibility settled heavily over the chamber. Elena's mind raced, trying to reconcile the sudden, dizzying scope of what had begun as a simple story about a locked cellar and a stolen chance at a royal ceremony. She had come to the palace searching for nothing more than the right to be seen. She had not expected to find herself standing at the edge of a conspiracy decades in the making. There is more, Corwin continued, his voice quieter now. According to what limited records survive, Lyra Ashgrove did not simply disappear quietly after her family's fall from grace. She fled the capital under circumstances the surviving documents describe only vaguely as urgent and dangerous. It is possible, though I cannot yet confirm it, that whoever orchestrated the Ashgrove family's erasure also sought to ensure no surviving heir remained to challenge the story later. Elena's hands tightened in her lap. You are saying my mother was in danger, that I might have been in danger, even as a child. It is possible, Corwin admitted, which raises an important question, now that your identity has become known publicly, following the ceremony. If Duke Thornberry, or whoever orchestrated your family's erasure decades ago, learns that an Ashgrove heir has resurfaced and been formally recognized by the crown itself, it is reasonable to assume they will not welcome the development. Cale's expression had hardened into something Elena had not yet seen from him, a cold, protective focus that settled over his features like armor. Then we proceed carefully, he said. Elena's safety takes priority over the speed of this investigation. I will not have her placed at greater risk simply to satisfy curiosity about events 2 decades old. With respect, Your Majesty, Corwin said, I do not believe caution alone will be sufficient. If Duke Thornberry is indeed responsible, he has spent 25 years successfully concealing his involvement. He will not simply allow the truth to surface without resistance. Elena looked between the two men, feeling the fragile sense of safety she had begun to build since the ceremony threatened to crack beneath the weight of this new revelation. 2 nights ago, her greatest fear had been standing before the entire kingdom and being dismissed as unworthy. Now, it seemed, the greater danger had always been waiting quietly in the shadows of her own forgotten history, patient and unresolved, waiting for the moment she finally stepped into the light. Whatever this becomes, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected given the fear coiling tightly in her chest. I would rather know the truth and face it directly than spend another moment of my life hidden away, the way I spent the years before this one. Cale turned to look at her, and something in his expression, admiration mixed with quiet, fierce protectiveness, told her that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. Word of the ceremony's astonishing conclusion spread through the capital within days, carried by servants and merchants and traveling nobles, until every corner of the kingdom had heard some version of the story. An unknown, forgotten woman, revealed as the Alpha King's true fated mate, her long-lost bloodline restored to public knowledge after decades of silence. Most who heard the tale found it romantic, almost like something pulled from an old fireside story. Duke Aldrich Thornberry, receiving the news in the privacy of his study 3 days after the ceremony, found it considerably less charming. He read the formal summary Corwin had circulated among the council members, with careful, controlled stillness, his expression betraying nothing to the servant who had delivered it. Only once the door closed behind the departing servant did his composure finally crack, his hand tightening around the parchment until the edges crumpled beneath his fingers. 25 years. 25 years of careful work, of patient political maneuvering, of ensuring that every trace of the Ashgrove family's influence had been quietly, permanently erased from the kingdom's memory. He had believed, with reasonable confidence, that the last surviving heir had either died in hiding or lived out her days in obscurity, far from anywhere that mattered. He had not anticipated that she would leave behind a daughter, and he certainly had not anticipated that daughter walking directly into the Alpha King's ceremonial hall wearing her mother's own gown, carrying a mark that would immediately identify her true heritage to anyone with sufficient knowledge to recognize it. He set the crumpled parchment down and moved to the window overlooking the palace grounds in the distance, his mind already working through the narrowing set of options available to him. If Corwin's investigation continued unimpeded, it was only a matter of time before the surviving records, however carefully obscured, revealed enough to implicate him directly in the Ashgrove family's downfall. The consequences of that revelation would not be limited to political embarrassment. Deliberately orchestrating the destruction of a founding pack family carried penalties far more severe than mere disgrace. He summoned his most trusted steward, a quiet, loyal man named Garrick, who had served House Thornberry for over a decade, and whose discretion had proven reliable, time and again. When Garrick arrived, Aldrich wasted no time on pleasantries. "The girl who was presented at the ceremony," Aldrich said, his voice low and controlled despite the tension coiled tightly beneath it. "Elena Voss. She is currently residing at the palace, is she not?" "She is, my lord," Garrick confirmed. "Under close protection, from what I understand. The king has assigned additional guards to her chambers since the ceremony." Aldrich's jaw tightened at this information, though he had expected as much. "I need to know her movements. Where she goes, who she meets with, when the palace security around her might be at its thinnest. Discreetly, Garrick. This cannot trace back to House Thornberry under any circumstances." Garrick hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his otherwise carefully neutral expression. "My lord, if I may ask, what is the purpose of this information?" Aldrich turned to face him fully, his expression cold and resolute. "The purpose, Garrick, is ensuring that certain matters better left buried remain buried. I trust you understand the importance of loyalty in situations such as this one." Garrick's hesitation lingered a moment longer before he finally nodded, bowing his head respectfully. "Understood, my lord. I will begin gathering what information I can." After Garrick departed, Aldrich remained by the window for a long while, watching the distant palace spires catch the fading afternoon light. He told himself, as he had told himself many times over the years whenever guilt threatened to surface, that his actions decades ago had been necessary, that the Ashgrove family's growing influence had posed a genuine threat to the kingdom's stability, that removing them from power had ultimately served the greater good, regardless of the personal cost involved. It had been easier to believe that story when the consequences remained safely buried in the past. It was considerably harder to believe now, with those consequences standing very much alive within the palace walls, wearing her mother's face, and carrying her mother's forgotten name back into the light. 3 days later, Elena sat in the palace gardens with Cale, during a rare quiet moment between the ongoing investigation and the growing list of formal obligations that came with her newly recognized status. The late afternoon sun filtered gently through the surrounding trees, and for the first time since the ceremony, Elena allowed herself a small measure of peace, sitting beside Cale on a stone bench overlooking a quiet fountain, the weight of recent revelations momentarily set aside. "You have been quiet today," Cale observed, studying her expression carefully. "I keep thinking about my mother," Elena admitted. "About what it must have felt like, knowing her entire family had been destroyed, fleeing everything she knew, and never once telling my father the full truth of what happened to her. I wonder if she was afraid every single day of her life." Cale reached over and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing a slow, comforting circle against her palm. "Whatever fear she carried, she also carried enough hope to leave that gown behind for you, along with instructions for it to reach you when the time was right. That does not sound like someone who had given up." Elena considered this, turning it over slowly in her mind. "No," she agreed after a moment. "It does not." Before either of them could say anything further, one of the palace guards approached quickly, his expression tense with urgency, that immediately drew Cale's full attention. "Your Majesty," the guard said, bowing briefly before continuing. "Corwin requests your presence immediately. He says he has found something in the archives that cannot wait." Cale rose immediately, his relaxed posture from moments earlier replaced entirely by focused alertness. He turned back to Elena, offering his hand to help her rise as well. "Come," he said. "Whatever Corwin has found, I suspect it concerns you as much as it concerns me." They followed the guard through the palace corridors at a brisk pace, Elena's earlier peace giving way once more to the familiar tension that had settled over her in the days since the ceremony. A quiet, persistent awareness that whatever peace she managed to find now existed alongside a danger neither she nor Cale had yet fully understood. Corwin waited for them in the archive chamber, several old documents spread carefully across the long wooden table, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and lingering unease. He gestured for them to sit as they entered, waiting only until the door closed securely behind them, before speaking. "I found a ledger," he said, buried among records that had been deliberately misfiled, likely in an effort to prevent exactly this kind of discovery. It documents a series of private payments made to several council members, roughly 25 years ago, around the same time the Ashgrove family's standing began its sudden collapse. Elena leaned forward, studying the faded ledger. Corwin slid across the table toward them. Columns of careful handwriting listed dates, amounts, and initials, rather than full names, though the pattern was unmistakable once laid out clearly. "Who authorized these payments?" Cale asked, his voice tight, with barely controlled anger, as he scanned the document. "The ledger itself does not name him directly," Corwin admitted. "Whoever kept these records was careful enough to avoid explicit identification. But the payments originate from an account historically associated with House Thornberry, and the timing aligns precisely with the period when the Ashgrove family's political influence collapsed, and their eventual erasure from official records began." Cale's expression darkened further, his jaw tightening with restrained fury. "Aldrich," he said quietly. "He has sat on my council for years, advised me on matters of state, and all the while, carried this buried beneath every conversation we have shared. I cannot yet prove his direct involvement, beyond circumstantial evidence," Corwin cautioned. "The ledger alone will not withstand formal scrutiny in a council hearing. We need something more concrete before any accusation can be made publicly." Before further discussion could continue, a sharp knock interrupted them, followed immediately by a guard entering without waiting for formal permission, his expression tense with urgency. "Your Majesty," he said, "there has been an incident near the eastern garden gate. A man was apprehended attempting to gain unauthorized access to the wing housing Lady Elena's chambers. He claims to have been sent to deliver a message, but his manner raised sufficient suspicion that the guards on duty detained him for questioning." Elena felt a cold chill settle over her at this news. The abstract danger Corwin had warned her about days earlier, suddenly rendered sharply, uncomfortably real. Cale rose immediately, his posture radiating a controlled intensity that made the surrounding guards straighten instinctively. "Bring him to the questioning chamber," Cale ordered. "I want to speak with him myself." The man detained near the garden gate turned out to be a servant Elena did not recognize, though something about his careful, deferential manner reminded her uncomfortably of the loyal household staff Marisol had once employed. Under Cale's direct, unwavering questioning, and faced with the clear seriousness of the charges against him, the man's composure finally broke. "I was sent by Duke Thornberry," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I was told only to observe her movements, to report back on the guard rotations around her chambers. I was never told the reason, my lord, I swear it. I was simply following instructions." Cale's expression hardened into something cold and resolute. "You were surveilling a member of the royal household on behalf of a sitting council member without authorization. That alone constitutes a serious offense, but combined with what we already suspect regarding Duke Thornberry's history, this confirms considerably more than mere curiosity." Corwin, who had followed them to the questioning chamber, exchanged a grave look with Cale. "This changes matters considerably," he said quietly. "If Thornberry is actively monitoring Elena's movements, it suggests he views her continued presence and the ongoing investigation into her family's history as a direct threat requiring immediate action." "Then we act first," Cale said firmly. "I will not wait for him to make whatever move he is planning. Summon the full council for an emergency session tomorrow morning. I want Duke Thornberry present, and I want the evidence we currently hold presented formally, alongside this man's testimony." That night, Elena found it difficult to rest, her mind circling restlessly around the sudden, tangible proof that danger had followed her discovery all the way into the palace itself. Cale found her sitting near the window of her chambers, staring out at the darkened gardens below, and settled quietly beside her, without needing to ask what troubled her. "You do not have to face tomorrow's council session if you are not ready," he said gently. "I can proceed with the evidence alone." Elena shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "I want to be there. My mother spent her entire life hiding from whatever happened 25 years ago. I do not intend to spend mine doing the same thing." Cale studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud flickering behind his amber eyes. "Then we face it together," he said quietly. "Whatever Thornberry has built to protect himself over the years, it will not survive the truth once it finally comes to light." The following morning, the council chamber filled with tense, uncertain energy as members gathered for the emergency session Cale had called, with little explanation beyond its urgency. Duke Aldrich Thornberry arrived composed and unhurried, taking his customary seat near the head of the long table, with the practiced ease of a man who had weathered countless political storms throughout his tenure. If he suspected the true purpose behind the summons, his expression gave nothing away. Cale wasted no time on formalities once the session began. He laid out the evidence methodically, the ledger documenting suspicious payments, the timing that aligned precisely with the Ashgrove family's downfall, and finally, the testimony of the servant apprehended attempting to surveil Elena's chambers, a servant who confirmed, under the full weight of the council's attention, that his instructions had come directly from Duke Thornberry himself. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the accusation settled fully into the room. Aldrich's composed expression finally cracked, color draining slowly from his face as every eye in the chamber turned toward him, waiting for a response he clearly had not prepared to give. "This is absurd," he began, though his voice lacked the confident authority it usually carried. "Circumstantial evidence and the desperate claims of a frightened servant hardly constitute proof of the account the payments originated from belongs to House Thornberry," Corwin interrupted calmly, sliding the ledger across the table for the assembled council to examine directly. "And the servant in question has confirmed under formal questioning that his instructions came from you personally, Duke Thornberry. I would suggest, given the severity of these accusations, that further denial will only worsen the consequences you now face." Aldrich's gaze moved slowly around the chamber, taking in the grim, expectant faces of his fellow council members, before finally settling on Elena, seated quietly beside Cale, her expression steady despite the tension radiating through the room. Something in her calm, unwavering presence seemed to finally break through whatever remaining resistance he had been clinging to. "She should never have survived," he said quietly, the confession slipping free almost involuntarily, as though decades of carefully guarded secrecy had finally exhausted itself entirely. "I did what was necessary to protect this kingdom from a family whose influence had grown dangerously unchecked. I do not regret the decision. I only regret that it was not thorough enough to prevent this moment from ever arriving." The chamber erupted into immediate, outraged commotion at this open admission, council members rising from their seats in shock and anger, guards moving swiftly to flank Aldrich's position at the table. Cale rose as well, his expression carved from cold, unwavering authority, as he addressed the chamber directly. "Duke Aldrich Thornberry," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the surrounding noise, "you stand confessed, before this full council, of orchestrating the destruction of a founding Pack family, and of subsequently ordering the surveillance of that family's surviving heir, within these very palace walls. You are hereby stripped of your council position, and your title, effective immediately, pending formal trial before the Crown's tribunal." The guards moved forward to escort Aldrich from the chamber, his earlier composure entirely abandoned now, replaced by the hollow resignation of a man whose carefully constructed world had finally, irrevocably collapsed around him. Elena watched him go, feeling not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more complicated, a slow, settling sense that the shadow which had followed her mother's memory for 25 years had finally, fully lifted. In the weeks that followed Duke Thornberry's downfall, the kingdom settled slowly into a new rhythm, one shaped by the quiet, steady presence of a woman, whose name had been unknown to most of its citizens only a month earlier. Elena's formal recognition as the last surviving heir of the Ashgrove line was announced publicly, alongside the restoration of the family's ancestral standing, a standing that had waited patiently, buried, but never entirely erased, for 25 long years. Marisol's fate, once the full weight of the ceremony's aftermath became clear, unfolded with considerably less mercy than she might have hoped for. Formally charged with unlawfully confining a legitimate candidate on the night of a mandatory royal ceremony, she faced the Crown's judgment in a proceeding considerably smaller and quieter than the council session that had exposed Aldrich Thornberry, but no less final in its consequences. Stripped of the modest standing she had maintained through her marriage to Elena's father, she was ordered to relinquish the Voss household entirely, the property and its remaining assets reverting to Elena as the family's only true remaining heir. Priya and Odette, though not formally charged alongside their mother, found their own social standing considerably diminished in the aftermath. The household that had once opened doors throughout the kingdom's noble circles, now closed to them entirely. Elena, when informed of their reduced circumstances, felt no particular satisfaction in the news, though she felt no inclination toward mercy either. She had spent enough years absorbing the consequences of Marisol's cruelty. She did not feel obligated to soften the consequences now finally landing on the family that had caused it. Ren, whose quiet courage on the night of the ceremony had set everything else into motion, was given a permanent position within the palace household at Elena's personal request, a role considerably more comfortable and secure than anything she had known during her years of service to the Voss family. When Elena thanked her formally for everything she had risked that night, Ren simply smiled, her eyes bright with quiet pride. "I only did what your mother would have wanted," she said. "The rest, child, you managed entirely on your own." As the kingdom's formal mourning period for the crimes uncovered within its own council concluded, preparations began for a new celebration, one considerably more joyful than the tense, uncertain weeks that had preceded it. Cale's formal announcement of his intended mate had already spread throughout the realm following the ceremony itself, but tradition required a second, more elaborate ceremony to formally recognize their bond before the full court and the wider kingdom, a celebration that would stretch across 3 full days of festivities. Elena stood once more in the great ceremonial hall on the morning of that celebration, though everything about the moment felt entirely different from the frightened, breathless arrival that had brought her there weeks earlier. She wore a new gown now, commissioned specifically for the occasion, though she had insisted on incorporating small details from her mother's original ceremonial dress into its design, a quiet tribute to the woman whose courage and foresight had ultimately changed the course of Elena's entire life. Cale waited for her at the front of the hall, dressed in formal royal attire befitting the occasion, though the warmth in his expression as she approached carried none of the careful, controlled neutrality he had worn during the original ceremony. Corwin stood nearby, along with representatives from every noble house in the kingdom, all gathered to witness the formal recognition of a bond that had begun, improbably, with a locked cellar door and a desperate run through a moonlit forest. "You look every bit as remarkable as you did the night I first saw you," Cale said quietly as she reached him, his voice carrying warmth that made her smile, despite the formal solemnity of the occasion. "I feel considerably less terrified this time," Elena admitted, and Cale's answering laugh, rare and genuine, drew a soft ripple of warmth through the watching crowd. The formal ceremony proceeded with all the traditional elements the kingdom's customs required, vows exchanged before the assembled court, the crown officially recognizing Elena's new status as queen consort, and a final blessing offered by Corwin himself, whose role in uncovering the truth of Elena's heritage had earned him considerable respect throughout the recent weeks of upheaval. But it was the quiet moment following the formal proceedings, when the crowd's attention shifted toward the beginning of the celebratory feast, that Elena found herself most acutely aware of exactly how far she had traveled since that terrified night locked in a cold, dark cellar. She stood beside Cale near the edge of the hall, watching the joyful chaos of the gathered court settle into celebration, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of her mother, of the quiet courage it must have taken to flee everything familiar and build a new life from nothing, all while carrying the hope that one day her daughter might finally step into the truth that had been denied her. "She would be proud of you," Cale said softly, following the direction of her thoughtful gaze, though he could not have known its exact source. "Whatever she endured, whatever fear she carried, I believe she would look at the woman standing before me now and recognize every bit of the strength she hoped to pass on." Elena reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a quiet, steady confidence that would have seemed impossible to the frightened girl who had once believed herself too plain and unwanted to matter to anyone. "I hope so," she said. "I spent so many years believing I was invisible. I never imagined I would end up here." "You were never invisible," Cale said, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying the same quiet certainty it had held the moment he lifted her veil weeks earlier. "You were simply waiting for the right moment to be seen." Outside the great hall, the kingdom continued its celebration long into the evening, torches lighting the courtyards and gardens where ordinary citizens gathered to share in the joy of a story that had already begun spreading through every corner of the realm, the story of an overlooked, undervalued girl who had refused to accept the smallness others tried to force upon her, who had run through a dark forest toward an uncertain future, and who had found, waiting at the end of that desperate run, not rejection, but recognition, not dismissal, but a place finally, truly her own. And within the palace walls, as the celebration continued around them, Elena Voss, once dismissed as too plain and unworthy to matter, stood as queen beside the king, who had seen her clearly from the very first moment her veil lifted, her past finally reconciled, her future stretching ahead of her bright and unafraid, exactly as her mother had always hoped it would.